Welcome to Testaments of Faith, Ruth, the foreigner who became chosen, a story of love, faith, and redemption. Chapter 1. The path of loss, when hope seems to fade. In the days when judges ruled Israel, famine ravaged the land. Bethlehem, the city whose name means house of bread, had become a place of scarcity and despair. Amid the drought and suffering, a man named Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, left for Moab, a foreign land, hoping to survive. They abandoned their homeland, their people, and perhaps even their faith. But what seemed like a new beginning would soon turn into a path of sorrow. Time passed, and Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. Her sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, but after 10 years, tragedy struck again. Mahlon and Chilion also died. Now, Naomi was alone, without a husband, without sons, and without hope. The pain was unbearable, and in her heart, she believed that God had turned against her. But then, a glimmer of hope came from Bethlehem. The Lord had restored food to his land. With nothing left to lose, Naomi decided to return. Her home was broken, but her heart still longed for redemption. Naomi called her daughters-in-law and said, "Return to your families. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have with me." Through tears, Orpah resisted but eventually said her goodbye. But Ruth, holding Naomi's hand tightly, refused to leave. With a determined voice and unwavering gaze, she declared, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." At that moment, Ruth's story changed forever. The Moabite woman chose to leave everything behind, even her culture, to follow a God she barely knew. She had no idea, but her faithfulness was about to place her at the very center of God's divine plan. Chapter 2. The return to Bethlehem, the city that would change her destiny. The sun was setting as Naomi and Ruth finally reached the hills of Bethlehem. The long journey from Moab had been arduous, but now they stood before the city Naomi once called home. The streets were busy, and soon, eyes turned toward the two weary travelers. Whispers spread quickly. "Is this Naomi, the one who left with her family?" But Naomi, with a bitter look, raised her hand and replied, "Do not call me Naomi, pleasant. Call me Mara, bitter, for the Almighty has afflicted me." To her, there was no more joy, only a heart weighed down by sorrow. What Naomi didn't know was that God was about to turn her bitterness into redemption. Ruth took in everything around her, feeling like a stranger in a foreign land. Her accent marked her as a Moabite, and the wary glances were hard to ignore. But her commitment was to Naomi and the God of Israel. She had no plan, only faith. The famine had ended, and the barley harvest was beginning. In Bethlehem, the fields were ripe for gathering, but Ruth's heart was still waiting for its own season of renewal. With no husband, no children, and no means of support, Naomi and Ruth needed to find a way to survive. The young Moabite turned to her mother-in-law and said, "Let me go to the fields and gather grain behind anyone who allows me." Naomi, weary, replied, "Go, my daughter." Little did Ruth know that God was already directing her steps. She would not only gather barley but also a new life, and in an ordinary field, her destiny was about to unfold. Chapter 3. The Field of Destiny, when chance is the hand of God. The sun bathed the fields of Bethlehem in gold as Ruth walked among the dry stalks, feeling the weight of labor and uncertainty. She had entered an ordinary field, unaware of its owner, but chance does not rule those who are guided by God. With a humble heart, she bent down to gather what the harvesters left behind, not realizing that her steps were being directed toward something far greater than mere barley. The owner of the field was Boaz, a man of wealth and honor, a relative of Elimelech, Ruth's late father-in-law. As he observed his workers, his eyes fell upon the young Moabite. Curious, he asked his foreman, "Who is this woman?" The overseer replied, She is the Moabite who returned with Naomi. She asked permission to gather behind the harvesters and has worked tirelessly since morning. Boaz's interest deepened. There was something special about her, beyond beauty and diligence. Without hesitation, Boaz approached her and said, "Stay only in my field, my daughter. Here you will be safe. Drink from the water of my servants and eat from their bread." Astonished by his kindness, Ruth bowed before him and asked, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, though I am a foreigner?" Boaz smiled and replied, "I have heard all that you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death. May the Lord reward your kindness, and may you find refuge under his wings." His words touched Ruth's heart. She arrived as a stranger, but now she saw that God was leading her to something greater. That day, she gathered more than just barley, she gathered hope. The hand of God was shaping a new beginning. Chapter 4. Protected by Grace, the favor that changes destinies. The day was ending in the fields of Bethlehem, and Ruth held tightly to the barley she had gathered. Her heart was grateful, but she had no idea that something even greater was unfolding. Boaz, the owner of the field, watched from a distance, drawn not just to Ruth's beauty, but to her devotion and humility. Without her knowing, God was weaving a destiny neither of them could have imagined. As mealtime arrived, Boaz invited Ruth to sit with him and his workers. The bread was dipped in vinegar, and she ate until she was full. But Boaz did more than that. He instructed his workers to leave extra stalks for Ruth to gather. She returned home carrying a harvest far greater than any foreigner could expect. When she arrived, Naomi was astonished by the abundance of barley. "Where did you gather today? In whose field did you work?" Ruth, her eyes gleaming, replied, "In the field of a man named Boaz." A chill ran down Naomi's spine. Boaz was a close relative of Elimelech, and that meant more than Ruth could understand. "Blessed be he by the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead," Naomi exclaimed. Then, holding Ruth's hands, she said, "My daughter, this man is our Redeemer." Questions filled Ruth's mind. What did it mean to be a Redeemer? She didn't know yet, but God's hand was moving every piece into place. There was no coincidence. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 5. Naomi's Plan. Preparing the path to redemption. Time passed, and Ruth continued gathering in Boaz's fields. Each day was a new sign of divine provision, but Naomi knew the harvest would soon end, and something had to be done. Her motherly heart longed to see Ruth secure, protected, with a future that didn't rely only on leftover grain. And so, a plan began to take shape. Naomi called Ruth and said, "My daughter, should I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you?" In Naomi's eyes, there was more than concern, there was hope. "Boaz, with whose maidservants you have worked, is he not our relative?" Naomi continued, "Tonight, he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. Wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to him until he has finished eating and drinking." Ruth's heart raced. What Naomi was suggesting was risky, but she trusted her mother-in-law. "I will do all that you say." These words marked the beginning of a step of faith that would change her life forever. As night fell, Ruth quietly made her way to the threshing floor. The moon cast its glow over the place, and she saw Boaz lying down at the edge of the grain pile, resting after a long day's work. Carefully she approached, uncovered his feet, and lay down there. It was a gesture of humility, a silent request for Boaz to be her redeemer. Israel's tradition allowed a close relative to redeem a widow, but it was up to Boaz to accept or decline this calling. Ruth's destiny now lay in the hands of a righteous man, and in the hands of God. Chapter 6. The Redemption Request, Boaz's Choice. The night deepened, and Ruth remained at Boaz's feet, waiting for the moment he would wake. The silence of the threshing floor was broken only by the soft whisper of the wind through the piles of barley. Then Boaz stirred, waking suddenly, and noticed a presence beside him. Startled, he asked, "Who are you?" His voice carried surprise but also respect. Ruth lifted her face and answered firmly, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over me, for you are a redeemer." Boaz's heart filled with admiration. He saw before him a virtuous and courageous woman, not seeking her own security but honoring the tradition of the Redeemer. With a gentle smile, Boaz replied, "Blessed are you by the Lord, my daughter. You did not seek after young men, whether rich or poor. Now, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for everyone in my town knows you are a virtuous woman." But there was a challenge. There was a closer relative who had the first right to redeem her. Boaz promised to settle the matter in the morning. If the other relative refused, he himself would take responsibility. Before dawn, Boaz instructed Ruth to leave quietly to protect her reputation. But before letting her go, he filled her cloak with barley and said, "Do not return to your mother-in-law empty-handed." Ruth hurried back to Naomi, her heart pounding. She did not know what would happen, but one thing was certain: God was in control. When she told everything to Naomi, her mother-in-law smiled and said, "My daughter, wait. This man will not rest until he has settled this matter." Ruth's fate was about to be sealed, and the divine plan continued to unfold. Chapter 7. The Redeemer, when justice meets grace. The sun had barely risen when Boaz walked through Bethlehem's gates with determined steps. His destination was the town square, where decisions were made before the elders. Ruth's future rested in the hands of this righteous man, and the outcome of her story depended on the words spoken here. Boaz sat down and waited. Soon, he spotted the man who, by law, was first in line to redeem the land. Calling him over, he gathered 10 elders as witnesses. The time had come to decide Ruth's fate. Boaz addressed the nearest kinsman. "Naomi, who returned from Moab, is selling the land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. You have the right to buy it in the presence of the elders. If you wish to redeem it, do so. But if not, tell me, so I may know." The man, eager for the land, immediately replied, "I will redeem it." A heavy silence fell upon the square, but Boaz then revealed what few knew. "On the day you acquire the land, you must also take Ruth, the Moabite, to raise offspring in Elimelech's name." The man hesitated. Redeeming land was a good investment, but marrying Ruth and producing heirs for another lineage complicated everything. After a moment of thought, he declared, "I cannot redeem it, for it would endanger my inheritance. Redeem it yourself." According to tradition, he removed his sandal and handed it to Boaz, sealing the agreement publicly. The people and the elders witnessed and blessed Boaz and Ruth, declaring, "May your house be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, and may the Lord make Ruth fruitful in Israel." The redemption was complete. The story of a foreign widow was transforming into a promise of hope. Chapter 8. The Wedding, when faithfulness is rewarded. The city of Bethlehem was filled with celebration. The name of Boaz echoed everywhere, for this righteous man had not only fulfilled his duty but had also restored the dignity of a foreign woman many had overlooked. Boaz and Ruth were now united, not just by legal tradition but by divine purpose. Their wedding was filled with joy, and the people of Israel witnessed a love built on faith and obedience. The Moabite widow who once arrived as an outcast was now the wife of one of the most respected men in the city. But God had something even greater in store. Ruth, who once carried only sorrow, now carried life. Time passed, and a child was born, bringing light to a household once marked by grief and loss. The women of the town gathered around Naomi, exclaiming, "Blessed be the Lord, who has given you a redeemer today. May his name be renowned in Israel." The woman who once called herself Mara, bitter, was now overflowing with joy. She held in her arms the very promise of God, and her tears of despair were replaced with laughter. The child was named Obed, and his birth not only restored the honor of Naomi and Ruth, but changed the course of Israel's lineage forever. Obed became the father of Jesse, and Jesse would father David, the greatest king of Israel. Little did Ruth know that her faithfulness and humility would place her in the very lineage of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The story of a foreigner became a living testimony that God does not look at nationality or past mistakes. He looks at hearts willing to trust Him. Chapter 9. Ruth's Legacy. When faith changes history. Time passed, but Ruth's story was never forgotten. Her name, once unknown, was now written into the royal lineage of Israel. The child born from her union with Boaz, Obed, would become the grandfather of David, Israel's greatest king. But the story did not end there. Generations later, from this very lineage, Jesus Christ would be born, the Redeemer of the world. A Moabite woman, a foreigner, once overlooked by society, became part of God's divine plan for the salvation of humanity. What began as a journey of grief and despair became a story of hope and redemption. Naomi, who once believed that God had forgotten her, witnessed firsthand that the Lord never abandons His people. Ruth, who left everything behind without knowing what awaited her, discovered that obedience and faith are rewarded beyond imagination. Boaz, a righteous man, proved that kindness and integrity can change destinies. Each character in this story teaches us that when we trust in God, He turns the ordinary into the extraordinary. Ruth's name has shone through the generations as a testimony that God does not choose people based on their past, but on their hearts willing to follow Him. She could have stayed in Moab, could have taken the easy path like Orpah, but she chose to trust, and her faith placed her in the lineage of the Savior of the world. Ruth's story is not just about marriage or a harvest, it is about God's love for those who seek Him. She reminds us that no one is beyond the reach of divine grace, and that, even in the darkest moments, God is working towards an ending far greater than we could ever imagine. The story of Ruth teaches us that God does not choose the strongest or the most powerful, but those who trust in Him. Even when everything seemed lost, Ruth remained faithful, and her faith led her to a destiny she could never have imagined. Maybe you are facing challenges, maybe you cannot see the path ahead, but remember, God is preparing something far greater than you can perceive right now. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content. Stay with God, and see you next time on Testaments of Faith. Thank you.